Hello, everyone. I'm with David Cardona today. He's a composer, music technologist, and teaches at Berklee College of Music. Thanks for taking the time out to meet me here in the EPD room, faculty development room, at the lovely EPD office. We had a nice lunch together. Yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation. You've been having a summer semester here since I suppose it would be May. How has that been going?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Summer semester is going well. Have my regular workload, so I have more time to take care of myself and self-preserve a little bit more, which is part of, I think, the Berkeley culture, both in terms of
Right.
faculty and students. There's
Mhm.
always a lot going on. It's a little bit more peaceful than usual, which I'm grateful for. And it gives me bandwidth to do things like this and to meet with former students and
Yeah.
have good conversations.
Yeah. I saw you pretty recently in Washington D.C. You were participating in the. Well, that's not good. You were participating in the Sound Scene Festival at the Hirshhorn Museum. So, yeah, could you tell us a little bit about that project?
Yeah, so the project itself was a bit of an invitation for people to bring down barriers, more kind of like the self imposed barriers of how you interact with something to invite play. We approached it with a small team. I developed this project. I was leading this project, but I developed it with two collaborators. One of them also an old Berkeley student. In fact, when I was a Berkeley student way back when, he was my roommate then. Um, Also focused on music technology and composition and things like that. And the other collaborator, she's a kind of like more visual artist, does a lot of sculpting, works with metal and crafting things. So the way that we approached it is we created this basically, there were shapes, there were icosahedrons, meaning 20 shaped polyhedron. And then you would pick them up, and as you would interact with them, they would generate sound, and they would also interact with a fluid simulation. Um, we found that when people would grab them, nothing was happening, and so they would be really curious about it. The shape itself invited a lot of curiosity. And as things started to happen, you would see them kind of like reconnect with this childlike curiosity and desire to play and explore um, kind of like their surroundings and their environment. Because of how also the system was put together, it invited collaboration, and we thought the result was fairly successful. Also, the response that we got both from the festival organizer as well as from the attendees was really quite positive. And because of the whole nurturing environment of first the Hirshhorn Museum, but second the Sound Scene Festival, both in terms of attendees and other participants, it really created an atmosphere that is is memorable and I will definitely carry with me, most likely forever. Yeah, it was a very special project.
I want to try and recall the first maybe installation based experience you had, which really prompted you into this field. It was in Sydney, I believe, at the Vivid Sydney Festival. Could you have imagined yourself getting into this field of work back then?
Uh, yes and no. I think it just what was possible wasn't clear to me. I knew that interactive media existed. I knew that there were all these spheres that I wanted to explore, and it was more what I was being exposed to that kind of like wasn't aware of what those opportunities were and how to engage with them. So once I got into interactive media, very quickly it made sense that there's a lot of space for people to develop work. There's a lot of demand, and there's a lot of engagement right now. I think there is an expectation from people to engage no longer only with one art medium, but now with many of them. especially visuals, because well, people tend to be more gravitating towards visual content, but in particular interactivity. So when I went to the Vivid Festival and I saw all these things, the first thing I thought is, I can do this. Because many of the projects weren't necessarily complex at a technical level. It was more the proposition that I thought was interesting. And to engage with that level of creativity was something that I felt I could engage with. What I couldn't engage with at the time was a lot of the technical aspects of it, and that's what kind of like offset me in this path. To do, however, the kind of work that I'm doing right now at the technical level at which I'm doing it, it's not something that I anticipated. Of course, I knew that I was going to aim for something that was very robust, high quality, high precision. It's the type of work that I like to pursue. And seeing it manifested now in interactive art is a little bit different for me. So both yes and no. When I saw all this work, it's like, yeah, I want to do this. But I didn't know it was going to stick, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Do you remember any particular examples of exhibitions or just any particular memories you have of that festival and things that you saw that really impressed you?
So two things come to mind. There were many, and I still remember a lot of that festival because I think it was a bit of a pivotal moment, right, in me deciding where I was going to keep going with my professional career. Although it's not just professional career. I think when you're in the arts, it's not only the professional aspect of your career that you're engaging with, you're also engaging with your personal relationship with creative expression and with the things that are valuable and meaningful to you. And the two things that jump at me when you ask me that question, first, there was an example of a very simple project where there were just, it was kind of like a checkered board in the floor, and children would jump and just the panels underneath them would light up with colors. And they were all over it and they loved it. And really the implementation is, there's nothing challenging there. It's a very low access, low technical access is what I mean, like somewhat easy to develop. But it was executed beautifully to the point where people were engaging, and it was, again, inciting maybe this play-like, childlike wonder that I was referencing a moment ago. And then the other project that I saw was actual projection mapping directly into Sydney Opera House. Incredible animations, very, very, very high quality work, engaging with a lot of fancy technologies. So that one, I think, was more kind of like that one took my breath away, but it didn't inspire the same sense of curiosity that the other one did, at least in the majority of attendees. Because I tend to engage with these pieces more at a, I think, cerebral level. I want to know how things work. Once I know how it works, I'm actually very bad audience. I no longer care. It's like, oh, okay, I know how it works, and then I leave. I'm not the kind of person who stays and engages, and it's like, oh, look how beautiful. Like, at some point, I no longer care, right? I only care about understanding the implementation. So there was a lot more of that in the more complex example, but people were just kind of like impressed by it, but you didn't see the same kind of wonder. So that's kind of what brought me into interactivity. This projection mapping, as amazing as it was all passive interactivity. You were just sitting there looking at pretty visuals projected onto a building. Cool, but there is no consequence of you being there or engaging with it at all. And that's a bit of what I saw in the other example, which was, again, very simple, but potentially more meaningful at a personal level.
In your own work, how do you navigate this balance between creating some kind of an artistic product that sounds like like an oxymoron, but like an artistic statement, and balancing that with some kind of technical precision? Because on the one hand, I mean, I'm sure you would say you have this desire to figure things out technically. It's just like this raw kind of feeling you get where you want to figure things out and develop products, make things. But on the other hand, you have to create this engaging artistic statement that doesn't necessarily hinge on the complexity of your technical process, right? It could be something simple, like in the case of the checkerboard thing, but it creates a lot of engagement. But you could also make something very, very sophisticated, and maybe it doesn't create that kind of engagement, even though it's super technical. So, how do you navigate that balance? Because I'm sure it must be hard to do both meaningfully.
So it is certainly a challenge. It is certainly a challenge, and I think it's a challenge that I'm somewhat forcing myself to better navigate. I don't think I'm the best at navigating it. I think I really like technical things. I really like knowing how the sausage is made. I really like knowing what's happening behind the scenes. And so in my own work, I really like figuring out optimization and approaches to make visuals and audio more engaging and interesting, sometimes even at the expense of usability. And then I try very hard to reconnect with all these things I studied in design, where I remind myself that I'm not my target audience. And usually I will ask my support system to just try what I'm building. In particular, my wife, I will be asking her, hey, can you try this for a moment? And then it's less a discussion on what she thinks, but rather observations on how she engages with the piece and how non-musicians, non-artists are engaging with the work, that somewhat inform how biased I'm being. Because I'm biased and I can't help it. We all can't. But at the same time, I do want to try and mitigate this. And more recently, I have noticed that I want to be able to better convey and communicate meaningful information through the type of work that I'm doing. And to that end, I think I want to further engage at not necessarily an academic level, but studying storytelling and learning how to communicate information through a narrative and a trajectory of how and when you convey and present information, right? The whole idea of tutorializing an installation, very gamified, right? It's how video games have somewhat taught people to think, and it's all very progressive. That's something that I'm yet trying to be better at, and that I continue to explore. But more often than not, and what I will end up doing is just chopping features. When I see that it's becoming too much and too engaging, like, people don't need to learn 17 buttons. People need to learn one gesture, and again, reconnecting with that humanity. Who am I designing for? Right? So I'm still learning how to balance it. I think we all are. And different pieces will then focus on more the cerebral stuff versus the visceral stuff, depending again on who the target audience is. If I know that there's kids there, visceral stuff, all fully how do you feel, instinct, engagement. For instance, the Hirschhorn installation, right? Versus things that I might be presenting to colleagues or to students here, people that want to engage with that more cerebral space. Then you build something a bit more complex and more interesting when it comes to those technical layers. So I think, and as always, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. People might love it or hate it for any reason. I just want to try to service the people I care about.
What you said earlier reminds me of a Bill Evans quote. I'm sure you know Bill Evans, the jazz pianist, right? He said something like, the musician, the ones who operate on, quote unquote, the high level, they must fight to possess the innocence that the layperson has, so that they can try and empathize with how they would interpret their art and music. Because I guess there's always that danger of, being a super professional or like super academic musician, and then not really knowing how people who aren't familiar with that world will engage with it. So, it's like, I guess a parallel could be, it's one thing to be able to write a thesis on physics, but it's another thing to be someone like Bill Nye the Science Guy and be able to present it, more, I guess efficiently might be one way to put it, just more approachably to like lay people, if that makes sense. is that something you think about often, like trying to appeal more accessibly to non-musicians, or just yeah, people who aren't engaged in this field very on a very technical level?
So, first of all, I think a lot of people might not care about who engages with their work, and there's a time and a place for that. Um, it's, I think, within the best interest of art to engage with people so that you can establish hopefully a bi-directional communication where you're inspiring people but also you're getting inspired by how people are engaging with this kind of work. So I do have a genuine interest in making my work accessible, and to every layer, right? I don't just mean accessible as in this is something that's more relatable, something that it's more concise and clear, and that someone with potentially no foundation can access.
Right.
But I also mean accessible in terms of accessibility and the realm of disability, and how is it that people who potentially have some kind of a physical or cognitive disability might also benefit from engaging with this kind of work. And at the end of the day, I want to create a memorable experience. I want to create something that people remember, hopefully lovingly. People might remember it for whatever reason, but memorable experiences tend to drive me more than simply doing work for the sake of doing work. And I think there's a time and a place for things. So when I'm doing research and I'm just focused on learning and kind of like writing documentation and putting together information so that I can teach my classes better and I can better collaborate with colleagues and peers, that's one aspect of the work that I do. But when it's time to put a product, an installation, an exhibition, something either in a museum, in the app store, in a website or whatever, then it's about the people and it's no longer about me. And I think in this more from creative writing, but the whole concept of kill your darlings, right? So the whole concept of kill your darlings is you have all of these things that you are attached to at a personal level, but when they're no longer serving the story or they're no longer beneficial to whatever it is that you're developing, it's also having the artistic maturity and the clarity to be like, okay, I love this, I need to set this aside right now because it's no longer helping the project. And I had to do that a lot for pretty much most projects that I have put in front of people. In fact, I say most to kind of like cover all my bases, but I cannot think of one where I haven't had ideas that I thought were really interesting, but weren't connecting with people. They were connecting with me, but they weren't connecting with people, and so I would decide to set them aside. And I think it speaks to how I want to connect to people. I don't just want to play cacophonous music in front of an audience and expect the three people that can relate to that to engage with it. I want to be able to present it to someone who maybe gets inspired, and then we can talk about all the cacophonous stuff that can come of it. So again, it goes back to target audience. The audiences that I want to connect with tend to be broader and maybe tend to be the people that need most inspiration. People who are already doing the work are already inspired. They're already doing whatever they want. I more want to bring that spark where it's needed.
One of the many things we've spoken about since we've known each other is the concept of self-learning, self-teaching, autodidactism. What is your relationship with that concept, and how did you really get into it? Because I know it's a big part of your own artistic journey.
So, yes, learning things has become essential to me. I mean, I liked school so much I had to come back, right? And now I'm in school for a living. And I get to share things that I'm passionate about with students that are also passionate about these things, and oftentimes they will bring ideas that are novel to me, things that I haven't explored before, things that I haven't connected with before, and thanks to my background, I will be able to at least advise or go and do a little bit of research to further connect with it. And so it's all about the learning, and it's all about iteration and kind of like reimagining what possibilities are available to us. In terms of being a self-learner, I don't think I was always a self-learner. I like to think that I was, but I don't think it was really the case. I think I was complacent after having finished Berkeley. I mixed records and I was happy with what I was doing. And in the meantime, I was, I don't know, reading philosophy and things that were appealing to me at the time. But I wasn't really trying to push the envelope. I wasn't really trying to connect with, again, this more cerebral space. I wasn't trying to develop products. I wasn't trying to develop new things in design. And I think what brought me back to it was just simply curiosity. I want to know how things are working. So that started little by little cascading into further studies. That's when I went and I did my master's. I didn't go and I did my master's immediately after school because I wanted to figure out what I actually wanted to do. It wasn't clear to me at the time. I knew that I wanted to do music, but I couldn't justify just going and doing a master's in music technology. And in fact, that's not what I did. I ended up doing things in digital media and in design, right? Precisely because of that curiosity. So for me, this self-teaching and autodidactic practice starts happening through the masters when I realize that I don't have the background that my colleagues have, because a lot of my peers, they were engineers, they were people who had been doing things in design and development before. I had no background in programming. That wasn't a thing at Berkeley when I was a student, right? So it's something that I needed to figure out on my own to be able to keep up with everyone. So I went and I did a lot of studying on my own just so I could, I don't know, I need to get an A in things, so that I could get an A. Initially, that kind of like brought it up, but I developed a system now of organizing information at a personal level that apparently connects with other people because my resources keeps being what students ask of me. It's like, hey, do you mind sharing your resources on Max? And it's like, here's what I compiled, right? And so once I have this kind of like an approach of connecting with information, then it starts cascading into a bunch of other practices. And not to get too far, but in terms of the psychology of learning and how we as humans internalize information, there are a bunch of schools of thoughts that come from Skinner, and they start again developing over time since the 50s, where we have behaviors that are developed, and then cognitively we're separating things into different bins, and then constructively we are making sense of information as it presents itself. But with the digital revolution, we've been able to store information outside of our brains. And what that means is, in Colombia, we have a saying that what's important is not to know, but to have the phone number of that one who knows. And so what I've been trying to do is to get a lot of those phone numbers. And what that means for me is not only having access to the people who have a very deep understanding of information, but rather build my own resource systems that I can lean onto. So I might not be able to recall something from memory immediately, like an equation or something like that that might be relevant, but I'm sure I have it somewhere in my resources written. And what's important is for me to create easier vehicles so that I can access it when I need it. So I think it's more of a recent development, and by now it's just something that I can't do without. Every time I try to learn a little bit about something, I can't learn a little bit about something. I need to throw myself at it. Just, I guess it's who I am.
It reminds me of one of my other guests, Doug Johnson. He's a pianist. He teaches piano here. But he too has this slightly obsessive approach to practice, which I think infected me too. So it's like once you figure out one polyrhythm, you cannot... Hello, Michelle. She's making a... Oh, she made a cameo.
Perfect.
That's good. But yeah, like if you practice one polyrhythm, you can probably extract so much more out of it, and it gets you in this rabbit hole. So I can relate with that. And I also love the saying that you mentioned, the one from Colombia, like you don't need to know everything. You can just have it handy, like know how to get there. So that's cool. In contrast to self-teaching, another memorable thing you shared with me was to try and go to school for to learn things that no one else could teach you, or like things that you would not bother learning yourself, if that makes sense. And that really clicked with me because I wouldn't want to learn a lot of composition things on my own. I would rather have someone else teach me that. So what are some things you've learned which you didn't want to teach yourself, but you saw a certain kind of justification behind, say, going to school for doing it? Because I know, based on our previous interview, that you sort of dropped performance because you figured for your goals you could pretty much with discipline you could just learn things on your own. But what are some other things that you learned from others that you couldn't have taught yourself?
I think it's not a matter of ability. I think you can teach yourself anything you want as long as there's enough motivation, but it's whether you can engage with that motivation. And intrinsic motivation is that which drives you internally for you to go and do something. And I think addressing intrinsic motivation in things that you're not good at is really hard, because people, especially young people, are not good at sucking at something. They're not good at, like, oh, I'm terrible at this. Usually when someone's terrible at something, it's like, okay, I'm terrible at this, I won't look at it again. But it's knowing that it's gonna suck for a little while, and that little by little things do start falling into place, so that you're a bit more proficient, and then all of a sudden you have a bit more fluidity within what you're doing, and then that intrinsic motivation actually comes. And that's when we lean into extrinsic motivation systems, things like school, right, where you have grades, and the extrinsic motivator is getting a good passing grade so that, I don't know, you can be proud of yourself, and your professor can be proud of yourself, and your family can be proud of yourself, right? And so we start connecting with all these other systems at a personal level. And this actually comes from, I learned this idea of engaging with what I didn't want to study, actually studying what I didn't want to study, from the father of a friend of mine, actually a hand surgeon. So he's a plastic surgeon. But he, at some point, wanted to do the best thing he could for his career, and apparently in the world of medicine, and I don't know if this is true or if this was just part of his story, people don't really want to study the hand, because hands are really hard. They have a lot of muscles, they have a lot of tendons, they have not tendons, but rather ligaments. And the structure is really, really hard, right, to understand the whole physiology of the hand. So people avoid it like the plague. So he threw himself headfirst into learning the hand, and that made him a specialist that very quickly moved him up in the ladder, because he knew something that was challenging, technical, and very much in demand, because hand problems, especially with computers and with the current technology that we have, are all over the place. And so that resonated with me. And I remember getting to Berkeley, and this was 15 years ago or something like that. No, more than that. It hurts a little when I think about it. But I remember getting to Berkeley and declaring a dual major in contemporary writing and production and performance. And as you said, at some point I realized that I was motivated enough to play guitar. I knew how to play guitar, and what we were studying in performance, yeah, there were some interesting scales and some cool riffs in there, and yeah, I would learn about some musical traditions through connecting with an actual person. But a lot of what we were studying was how to apply a lot of the concepts. As a student, I was learning already in Harmony 3 and Harmony 4 and things like this, so that I could have more of a vocabulary when I was playing guitar. And so that didn't feel like the best use of my time and resources. Resources, I mean financial resources, because it was an expensive school. Still is. And so through that, I made the choice to go study what I didn't want to study on my own, which was electronic music. And ironically, that's what I do now for a living. But to me, that's the hard stuff. I didn't want to sit down and figure out sample rate and bit resolution and then synthesis. My God, synthesis, right? And looking at a modular synthesizer and just being paralyzed. That was what I wanted to demystify. And demystifying that on your own, I think it's a very easy way for you to end up with a lot of gaps of knowledge. But on the other hand, that is a perfect opportunity for someone to give you that, to someone who has dedicated their lives to learning that and potentially even developing that, to show you the lay of the land. Um, so yeah, I think it's a matter of studying the hard stuff, and I think it takes a good look at yourself to know what your priorities are and what you want to get out of things. Some people are in school just because family expects it or society expects that they go to school, and so they want to make their lives easier because they don't really care, and that's all right. That's one approach, and it's not that they don't care at a personal level, just their interests and priorities are elsewhere. But when your priority is to actually be better at something and really care about a specific topic, it's also a matter of considering what you're the best at and what you're the worst at. And you can try to be a specialist and just tunnel vision into what you're really, really, really good at, or you can try to be more well rounded and go look at what you're really bad at so that you get better at it. And going back to my personal experience in contemporary writing and production, I wasn't getting all the production that I wanted. I got some basic concepts, and I was somewhat interested, not because, wow, I really care about sample rate, but rather because I knew it was important. And I wasn't getting it to where I wanted to get it. So that, again, pushed me into going and studying the stuff that I didn't have enough patience to study on my own. No. Yeah.
And how does all of this transition into your teaching career? And what does it mean for you to be an educator now?
I ended up an educator by accident. I had no idea this was going to happen. To be honest with you, I was convinced I wasn't going to get the job. Like, as simple as that. But I remember just really liking school. I was doing my master's at the time, and I was really engaging with the topics, and every time it was actually funny. I was taking a video editing class, and so the whole point for the final project was to make this kind of like cohesive film or video or something. And I asked the person if she minded if I just created a bunch of particle system videos in Jitter and just edit them into a music video for something. And I did, and I used all the tools that they taught in the class. Like, she was concerned that I was just going to end up using whatever framework I was working with. It was Jitter, right? She was concerned that I was going to end up doing that, but no, I ended up working with everything that we worked on in class, like Premiere, and I actually used multicam, the kind of stuff that they use in sports, for like now camera 1, camera 2, camera 3, and I had like 5 different videos with particle systems, all of them different, and now just choosing in between them in real time, reacting to the performance. So kind of like finding ways for me to implement it within what I was interested in. So again, there is this drive and there is this need to learn and to engage with art at a higher level. And I saw this job opening for Berkeley, and I was like, wow, it sounds like it fits. It's never gonna happen, but if I don't send my application, then it's a definite no. If I send my application, then it's most likely a no. I tried and I got the job, and I was baffled. I couldn't believe it. I was like, why would you choose this? And then when I actually started teaching, it just felt really natural. It was the most bizarre thing. I remember my first class was on a Wednesday, 11 to 1. It was a max class. You were in it. You were in my first class ever, right? And I had done some private instruction before, and I had done private instruction in production. I had done private instruction also for people with disabilities, also in the realm of production. But I just got into that classroom and I started talking, and it just fell into place, at least from my biased perspective, very smoothly. It just clicked. I think it happened for 2 reasons. The first reason why I think it clicked is because of how my father was. My father was a very patient person. My father did his fair share of kind of like teaching assistant when he was doing his college work, and so he was very methodic, and I think I was able to embody a lot of that in my personal practice just because that was my upbringing. But the second reason why I think it really worked is because at nights I had to walk the dog, and I would go and walk the dog for 20 minutes to 30 minutes. And my mother was living alone in Colombia, and I didn't want her to feel lonely. After my dad passed, I just wanted to make sure that my mom felt like she had a support system. So I would call her every night when I was walking the dog. And you can imagine talking to your mom 20 to 30 minutes a day is not easy. Yeah, right. And the thing is, you run out of topics very quickly. And my mom is not a person that shares a lot. She likes to listen, but she's not a person that's going to tell you a lot of things. Right? So after we were done with like, what did you do today, and did you have lunch, and how did you make it, and blah, and we would kind of like be over with it, we'd be out of topic, and we had 20 minutes to go because I was walking the dog. And so I would talk to her, poor woman. I would talk to her about things that were interesting to me, and I would talk to her about things that I cared about and things that I was studying. And so, for instance, my mom knows audio. My mom has never touched any kind of audio process, but my mom can tell you how compressor works.
Wow.
Really, really. I mean it. I've checked.
That's crazy.
Because we would talk about it, and I would tell her about all these thresholds and ratios, and I would explain how attack and release don't only engage when the compressor opens. Like, poor woman, really. But then on top of that, we would talk about 3D graphics and how things were working and all of this, because it was that or just being quiet on the phone for 20 minutes. But when you do that for like 2 years every night, you get somewhat good at explaining complex, challenging topics to people that don't have a foundation. So frankly, it's more, I want to thank my parents for everything that they did for me kind of a thing. Yeah, of course. My dad very directly because of the upbringing, and my mom is more for giving me that experience and that space for me to have that experience, and for being the kind of patient woman she is. And I think that all then comes together in me as an educator, as a person who just, frankly, by now, I just go and talk about things that I care about and things that are interesting to me, which happens, fortunately, to be the things that students are interested in. So we connect at a very personal level through that. But I would say that's how it became natural. I'm not exactly sure if that addresses your question of what does it mean to be now an educator and that kind of transition, but really that's what I think informed all of my process. And just why do I care? Just the kind of joy when the project clicks for a student. Nothing else brings that. Right? When everything clicks and everything works, and you see this, it's almost like a fix, right? Like you see these pupils this size, they haven't slept in days, and then all of a sudden everything works. That's irreplaceable. So it becomes really meaningful, and somewhat, if they can benefit from my efforts, then even better.
That's just such a sweet story with your mom. And yeah, like I was definitely in your first course ever, and it is pretty surprising to think that that was your first semester teaching, because I'm sure everyone in that class and every other student who's been in your class since would agree. Yeah, they're all super smooth, super methodical. So yeah, we really appreciate you for that, for sure. What are some of your favorite courses to teach at Berkeley?
My favorite courses to teach at Berkeley, I think it has to do with semester to semester, right? First of all, the course content itself doesn't make the course. The students make the course. And when there's good dynamic with the students, it doesn't matter what it is that I'm teaching, but when we connect and they're engaged with the topic and asking questions and trying things out and failing, and then having the resilience to get up and try again, that's what makes an amazing course. Like when we have this exchange of ideas, that would be my favorite course to teach. It doesn't matter what it is. Because sometimes I have the classes that I've always thought, oh, this is my favorite class to teach, and then I walk into a room where no one's engaging. And you see the projects and you know that they're learning things, but the kind of engagement that you're getting is no longer as personal. That's hard, right? It makes it really hard, because then all of a sudden I'm in front of people lecturing for 2 hours, which feels dull. So my favorite course has to be the one where people are engaging. As for subjects, I really like teaching game audio. I really like teaching game audio because it asks a lot of me. As I said a moment ago, I'm more recently interested in kind of like learning storytelling. And it's not because I want to tell stories. I don't want to go and write the next great anime or anything like that. I don't care. But I think knowing storytelling is a way for you to learn how to convey information and maintain interest and keep people with you the whole time. And I think game audio will naturally do that because you need to set up the scenario of why would I care how quickly something is moving, right? But if all of a sudden you say your player is moving very fast, so your wind needs to react to create an ambience that is immersive, all of a sudden you have something very, very valuable. So it asks a lot of me to figure out and come up with examples on the spot. Apparently I was speaking too much on goblins, and I was saying, like, imagine you're surrounded by 50 goblins and you need to fight these goblins and creatures. So that to me is something that allows me to connect with this more creative, non-musical field to then make really musical gestures, right? So I really love teaching game audio. I really love teaching all sorts of design classes, whether it's instrument design, whether it's circuit bending, whether it's microcontrollers and working with microcontrollers and sensors and gestures. I really love that because it's not only the Lego for adults of putting together this electronic circuit and when it finally beeps, the joy that people get, amazing. But it's also really trying to connect with how people are going to engage with something. I think we go back full circle to the beginning of our conversation when we're talking about this installation of, like, what do you expect people to do? What's the input and what's the output of the experience, right? And how is it that you really connect with it? So that's something that also completely fuels me. And then, obviously, my game programming class is something that I very much love. But that's more selfish. That's more like at a technical level, it is where we get to look at how games are made. And frankly, when people realize what goes on in a video game, no one's indifferent. They either love it or hate it. And that's okay with me, right? Like, I connected with it and I no longer play games, but I for sure love making them. But there's people who really don't want to know anything about making them anymore, ever again, but would rather play them endlessly. So at a technical level, it allows me to talk about computers and basically what's happening behind the scenes, and it becomes like this David's curiosity box kind of a thing where this is how memory works and this is how you're handling parallel processing and things like that. I think it's where I get the most geeky, which is happening everywhere, but still. I'd have to pick those three.
Mm-hmm. So you're from Colombia. I believe you told me you arrived in the U.S. when you were 16 or 17, so pretty young, not even close to adulthood, as many other college students are. And now in the U.S. you've found a very nice place, a nice environment where you can pretty much safely pursue your artistic inclinations. And you've brought up this issue of having this a privilege, or having this freedom to work in a country like the U.S. and how if you were back home, you'd probably be working on something that didn't interest you as much, something like live sound or programming websites, things like that. What are your thoughts on people being able to move around and being able to pursue their artistic inclinations, even if it's far away from their quote unquote home country?
I think that question has many dimensions, right? So at a personal level, you're right. I left Colombia when I was 16, and I left to do music because I had the privilege of pursuing the things that I cared about. Which, by the way, has continued to be the case, right? I graduated from Berkeley. I did music for 10 years. I still do, but I did music for 10 years and I mixed records and I had the time of my life. And then when I decided to shift gears and learn more about design and development, I also had the privilege to do that. So based on that, like, first of all, I want to acknowledge that privilege that I have had, that it's, and the kind of freedom that you're describing of just pursuing that kind of artistry, it is not viable for everyone because of resources, because of personal situations, because of commitments that you have to maybe a family company. There's people who grow up and they know that when they grow up they're going to take over the family business and things like that, right? And there's unavoidable situations like that, and I was fortunate that that wasn't the case for me. And some people might be really fortunate that that's the case for them, right? For me, just my situation happened to work really well. I think moving away from home very early is challenging. In fact, when I say home, I feel weirdly because it doesn't feel like home. I am from Colombia. I was born in Colombia, but I haven't lived in Colombia in 18 years. It hurts more and more. But anyway, I haven't lived there for the longest time, to the point where I no longer recognize. I mean, I recognize the culture, but I don't know the places that they hang out in. I don't know what it entails. I don't know the people that my friends are marrying, right? And also not particularly going to their weddings. So you start growing apart. In the US, I connected with something that I was very passionate about and that continued to fuel me. And as you said, it is true that there is not that much of a scene of something like this in Colombia. And you know, me saying that probably if I were to go back to Colombia, the only thing that I would be doing are websites and potentially live sound. To a certain degree, that's true. And there's also something to be said of just going back to your country and really pushing the envelope of what exists and being a pioneer for many people who are coming behind you, right? The whole trailblazing aspect of it is also very interesting and very appealing, but it's very hard, right? It's all of a sudden believing in yourself to no avail, like almost blindly. And then on top of that, having to figure out your resources so that you can do what you want to do, knowing that that's probably going to be initially an ungrateful endeavor where you're not making anything in return, right? So in terms of being able to pursue this, I don't necessarily just want to build new things. I also want to learn from what's around me. And thanks to being in the US, which is a first world country, and I think that's what's important. It's not that it's the US, it's that it's a first world country that has priorities that are similar to mine. There's other first world countries that don't have the same kind of priorities. Like Germany being such a technology driven place, it doesn't have the same interest in interactive technology that I do. But places like Canada might, right? Especially in Vancouver with all their movement in VFX. And there's also third world countries that are betting on interactivity. Countries like Turkey are pushing that a bit too much. I would have to learn Turkish hard, but still. So going back now to kind of like this notion of where you are and the place that you are and the opportunities that that brings, I think it shifts, and being able to move to the world freely, it's something that's very valuable, but it also comes at a cost. I, for instance, feel very rootless. I feel like I don't have roots because I left Colombia very, very early, to the point where, yeah, I have the accent and I have my old friends from school, but I can't really connect that with my whole sense of belonging. I have no sense of belonging to Colombia. And the US has been a country, and now it's a country that reminds people that they're not from here, right? And after devoting so much time to this place, that can be a little bit challenging, right? And it's something that's challenging to digest. Just feeling still like this is very transitional after 18 years, it no longer feels transitional. Because it's the place where I developed the majority and established and solidified the majority of what my personality became, right? As an educator, as an academic, as a technologist, as an artist, and as a person. So it becomes kind of like a trade-off. What is it that you're giving in return? And sometimes I wonder if I would want that sense of belonging instead, right? Even at the expense of all of these other wonderful privileges that I'm having. I do hope for one day being in a place where I am able to project myself how I want to project myself, and to be able to plant roots And for me, planting those roots implies some sort of permanence, implies not feeling like there's not going to be a place where I don't feel like an international person just because we have decided to label things with country flags, but a place where I don't feel like a stranger in a strange land, right?
Mm-hmm.
But rather like a part of the environment. And I think until that happens, everything's going to continue to feel really transitional, which for me, I think after so long, I have decided not to fight anymore. This whole notion of transition, and use it a bit as the fire that lights me and something that just keeps me moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
I think people should be aware that life is hard as an immigrant. It's hard living on your own. It was very hard to move on my own when I was 16. And granted, I met my friends, and then I made the worst choices. I remember receiving some kind of a family allowance and spending it all in the first 2 weeks and living 2 weeks off of pennies. Like, really, like I made the poorest choices, and that all of a sudden turned me into who I am. So it's not all for nothing, but it's also not easy. So I do love that freedom of exploring the world. I just don't know if it is for everyone. And with that, I more mean people should know what they're facing. I think if you know, you'll be fine. But if you don't know, the surprises can be quite shocking.
Yeah, as you said, there's so many dimensions to that question, and I'm sure we could keep speaking about it on so many different levels. But in the interest of time, we'll have to move to the fun activity I have for you. So we're going to look at some of your work, and
Okay.
you'll have to walk us through what's happening. So the first one, I actually only saw this recently on your website. It's this animation. Yeah. Would you like to explain what's happening?
I think this is somewhat not special. This is just parametric equations. It's just I am tracing a series of points. It looks more like a series of points, but it's really 2 points, right? You have the 2 points at the end that are driving the animation, and I'm keeping track of basically the previous instances of those points, and I'm drawing a line between those 2 points, and the way that they're moving is just following some kind of a chaotic equation. And then I draw lines. And if you notice, it loops. It's basically, I grabbed a render. I did this in, I think, Open Frameworks or processing. And I just rendered it as a bunch of still images. And at the time, I didn't embed P5 into my website. Otherwise, this would actually be generative. But all I did is I turned it into an image sequence, turned it into a GIF or GIF or whichever pronunciation people like. HIF or
I prefer HIF. No, I'm just joking.
Perfect, the HIF. And then it just loops back around. So it's basically a palindrome animation. But it's just outlining traces using fancy two-dimensional equations.
Is using a math equation or any kind of, let's say, very, how should I put this, very mathematical thing, is that often like a starting point for you?
It can be. It can be. In particular, I use that as a starting point when when I'm out of juice and I don't know what to do. Then I choose to go and try to learn a new concept, and that sometimes gives me a lot of energy. For things like this, this is based on something called attractors, complex, chaotic functions in mathematics. And then I go and I look at basically the equation. Sometimes I bother to understand it. Sometimes I know that that's going to require a lot more studying to acquire the foundation so that it's not way over my head. And then I just look at those equations, throw them into a program, and see if I can make the thing run. And when it runs, I'm very happy. And when it doesn't, I learn the thing. So yeah, I would say it's a useful starting point.
I guess this is just clicking for me now, but if you were to write, let's say, a piano piece, you could start off with something just as theoretical, but in a different way. You could start off with a very specific voicing or a very specific rhythm or something like that. So I guess when you're making generative art like this, using a mathematical equation is the perfect fit in some ways.
Yeah.
So that's cool. Well, the next one is something I had the pleasure of experiencing firsthand, and so did my friend Kuzema. This was these were your pods at the Hirshhorn. So yeah, I believe you were responsible for the inner circuit and also the visuals, which I can also pull up. But yeah, would you like to walk us through this?
Yeah, of course. So I actually I engage with this project from all angles. I designed the 3D model. So this is basically an icosahedron. Icosahedron is one of the 5 platonic solids. And in Platonic geometry, it's interesting that icosahedrons actually connect to water. So we leaned heavily into the theme of water. That's why we have fluid simulations. And that's why actually when you were moving them, what you were hearing was closer to raindrops and kind of like coastal tides. In addition to that, I had to figure out the electronics. We used an embedded system. We used a Raspberry Pi S02W, which is the smallest form factor of a Raspberry Pi that runs Rainbow, the Maximus P framework for embedded systems. And then in there, that's how we were running the water simulation that was playing, but also we were using it as a vehicle to connect. This has a motion sensor connected to it. It also has a power supply and the battery, which can actually be seen in the photo. And it had a self-contained speaker, so you would hear the simulation, but then from the motion sensor, because the S02W, the Raspberry Pi, had Wi-Fi capabilities, we would transmit that to a computer, and we would use that motion information to run the fluid simulation that I think is what you're referencing after, like what we're going to see in a moment. So designing the whole 3D enclosure was, I think, the biggest challenge. And then once we were done, I gave it to my collaborator, Annie. She is the visual artist that I mentioned earlier. And she had never worked with 3D printed materials before. This is PLA, so it's a plastic polymer. And she basically filed it, sanded it, painted it, and it painted it with something called interference painting. I had never heard of this before. But if you remember those notebooks from the 1990s and 2000s, where you would basically move them and it had this kind of like a hologram image, where depending on the angle you would see a shape or another one. Interference painting is very similar, where if you look at it from one angle, you're going to see one color, and if you look at it from the other one, you're going to see a different color. So red-green interference is very common. Gold-blue interference is also very common. And then leaning into these interference paintings, because of the small ridges that existed within the 3D printed filament, you would be able to see it very notably. And in fact, I think if you look at some of the hues on the shapes right here, you'll notice that there's a little bit of that weird contrast. It's not particularly one color, and it all has to do with how the light hits these particular shapes. And then my other collaborator, Alvaro, worked a lot on actually a generative music system. That one we didn't end up playing at the Hirshhorn because it felt like it was too much. It killed your darlings, going back to this. We all loved it, but it felt like it was too overwhelming for people that hadn't engaged with it. And on top of that, gave us the start to the fluid simulation in Jitter. Then I refined what he built so that we could have it multicolor and responding to 8 different icosahedrons at the same time. So yeah, this project, by far the most ambitious project I've developed, but it was really, really special. Yeah.
You had a lot of these objects, so I'm actually curious about how you managed to optimize the performance, because I'm sure it wasn't straightforward.
No, it was a nightmare. It was a nightmare. So the first thing that was important was that just each one of the Raspberry Pis could run the self-contained touch in it. and then that it was able to transmit data to the computer. And then for the fluid simulation, and this is what's interesting, in terms of optimization at least, we were using coordinates based on Euler angles. Euler angles as the rotation of the particular shape. And we were using those Euler angles to have basically control over the x-axis and the y-axis. And so as people would move it, they would kind of like change the placement of where the fluid that they were controlling was appearing on the screen. And each one had a different color. Each shape, each icosahedron had a different color. But the thing is, if we rendered everything and embedded all of the color information directly, the overhead was crazy. So I don't know how I came up with this, but I came up with this thing where we just rendered just colors in addition to the shapes onto a mask that then we would overlay. So all of the actual trails were black and white, but then we would just overlay kind of like an image of color, kind of like applying a colorful image or color correcting video or something like that. And so the way that we achieved color was just very, it was different, right? I hadn't seen anything like that before. I'm sure VFX people have, but basically we were using this mask and we were overlaying it, and that saved us so much processing, because then all of a sudden we didn't need 8 different renderers. We needed one place that was registering in the same matrix a bunch of different coordinates, and then on top of that just a 2D image that we were using to overlay and superimpose color in real time. Yeah, that was fairly special.
I think I get what you're saying. Here's it's a video, so we can look at it. The funny thing is, I know you were still working on the visuals, even like, so it was a 2-day exhibition, but you had reworked a bit of it, even before this, like in between the 2 days. So here's at least one iteration of it. How did you achieve this? Just like the visuals of it, like what was your process like?
So first of all, especially this was developed in Jitter. The Max and Jitter community, they are all about collaboration. So we started with some work that had been done. It's not precise fluid simulations, but it's some work that had been done for running fluid simulations in the GPU. And once we got that up and running, this is, by the way, using fluid simulations through iteration, using something called a Jacobian matrix, running it through 20 iterations. So basically we're resolving the complexity of a vector field where we have a lot of points, and we're saying depending on the forces that we're applying in what direction things are going to move, and that's how they're influencing each other and how they can collide with one another and kind of like engage in this more fluid-like structure. The iteration that you're mentioning, there were things about Max that I didn't know. Day one, and we tried to do an optimization thing where we were creating abstractions. But inside of those abstractions, I was using an object called value, or V. And I didn't know that value had global scope. I thought it had local scope, but it had global scope. And so I fought with it, and I tried, and it really wasn't working, to the point where day one we had to settle for just having just 1 or 2 overlays of color, just not all 8 of them, because it just wasn't moving as smoothly as we wanted it to, precisely because all 8 sensors were basically colliding inside of this value object. And I didn't really know what was happening. And also inside of abstractions, there's also, when you're creating an abstraction in Max, you also have send and receive objects, and when those send and receive objects have the same name, they're also global. That I knew, but what I didn't know is how to make them local. And it turns out that you can't really make them local, but inside of an abstraction, you can use the syntax #0, and that means that whenever you instantiate one, it will give it a unique name and identifier. So thanks to those fixes, I applied the thing with abstractions for send and receive, and I discovered that there's an object called PV, which is patcher value. and that is for local scope. And when we fixed those things, all of a sudden everything was super smooth. And in fact, what you're seeing here is what ended up happening in the second day, the second iteration. We had a more refined color palette when we were at the Smithsonian. This is more when we finally achieved the graphics in the development process. But this was working, and it wasn't working day one because this was all hardwired. This was all just the cables going from one place to another, as opposed to using send and receive and value, so that everything was a little bit more polished. Polishing is what broke it. So then for day two, once I figured out that there's a PV object, game changer. I went in, I changed that thing, and all of a sudden everything worked, and we were just blown away. That morning, in those 30 minutes of setup, the amount of hugs that we gave each other as a team when everything clicked, just it was remarkable. And actually, you were there both days, so you got to see both iterations, where the first one was more chaotic and it was this kind of like wall of color, and the second one was a lot more intentional and potentially and more evocative, because they weren't fighting each other for coordinates. All of a sudden, it was just the same ones. So yeah, that's pretty much what's going on here. And if you notice, all the colors that you're seeing here, like, yeah, there's some post-processing here. There's I'm pretty sure I'm using some bloom, and I'm using some lens correction and some motion blur in terms of post-processing. But all of the colors that you're seeing, that is the mask overlay that I was referencing a moment ago.
Very cool. And yeah, this is a super memorable experience for me, both personally and, in a more artistic way too. And I wish I had gone to your previous Hirshhorn exhibition. So I have all the three components of it, but I believe this is the main view of it. Yeah, could you walk us through this?
Yeah, so when we got accepted, this was for the sound scene that happened 2 years before. So this was 2023, and I developed this with a team that's based in Indiana. So they reached out to me. I didn't know them. They didn't know me. But the main designer discovered that I was developing technology, especially in the space of disability. And this installation in particular was a celebration of disability. And in fact, this is the view that's called the forest. If you notice, all the way in the back towards the right, where the actual hallway kind of like goes onto the distance, you can see the wheel of the actual cart of that one. Yeah. So we can come back to this one, but if you don't mind going back. You also notice that these are just kind of like standing pipes, and they have some white inscriptions on them. Each one of those inscriptions is the story of an everyday object that had its root on disabilities. So for example, I imagine you don't call your friends a lot, but you text them, right? And then you maybe call them when there's something important, but you're texting them primarily. That is actually the deaf community. So the deaf community comes up with text messages, and all of a sudden we all benefit from it, right? Telephone and all those calls. Alexander Graham Bell didn't set out to invent the telephone. He had two women in his life that he loved very much, but they were both hard of hearing and or deaf. That's his mom and his partner. And he set out to build mechanisms that amplified sound for them enough so that they could hear. And he thought it was a tremendous failure, but he came up with the telephone, right? So a lot of these inventions will have their roots in disability, because that's where we're trying to find solutions to people. And then when we see the practicalities, then centralized communities, no longer in the margins, can also maximize their engagement with these. So that was the main premise behind this installation. And basically all of these pillars have little snippets and little stories to invite people to engage with this concept. And then what's on the back, like that cart, if you don't mind, there you go. This is a wheelchair. It was a non-functional wheelchair. We didn't want to take a functioning wheelchair, but we repurposed it and we built this musical instrument. So this is a musical instrument right where the fingers are for the hand. That's actually a little grill, kind of like a grate. And right behind it we have speakers. And inside of that wooden enclosure, we put a computer running Max, surprise, and also running, or rather using an Arduino to communicate with Max rather. So on top of each one of these pipes, you'll notice that there's 6 pipes. There's 3 on the opposite side. There's 3 on the side that we're looking from. There are infrared sensors. So basically those are distance sensors. And when you would bring your hand close, a specific portion of soundscape that was playing would vary. In particular, it was more pitch related. We were having controls over pitch, and it wasn't very glissant though. It was more quantized. And so that allowed people to engage with different pipes to create different chords and different textures, again, based on the entire aesthetic. But all the samples that were being used, there were some elements that were procedural. There were also some samples to build a bit of a landscape. They were based on samples that were gathered from the objects that we wrote about.
Oh, okay.
So that way we were doing a bit of a full circle moment. But this is a self-contained instrument. It had everything inside of it. It had the speakers and all this, and it was really quite meaningful. This was a lot of work.
So this was probably before Rainbow stuff.
Oh yeah. 100. Rainbow didn't exist.
Right.
This is just Max, and it's actually using MSP for it, and talking to the Arduino using a serial object.
Sounds familiar.
It sounds like the instrument design class, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what's behind it.
Very cool.
And
Yeah, like slightly practical question. I'm guessing right beneath the object here, maybe you have some kind of a power supply, which would help charge the laptop.
you can see it. There is this tiny power cord.
Oh, okay.
But I am who I am, and I don't like dirty power because that leaks into your speakers. So I actually brought from my studio a Furman power conditioner, power regulator, because I found out in advance that the lighting system made a lot of the electric be rather noisy at the Hirschhorn, so they don't have the cleanest electric. They have very good electric for what they need, just maybe not for audio. So I brought my very own power conditioner to get rid of those spikes and those hums and all that. Yeah, so in there we have one of those, and we have the very long cord coming out of the back, and that's powering the computer, 2 speakers, an audio interface. Actually, that's it. Yeah.
Ooh, well, there's one more slide.
Oh yeah. This one, that they're also pipes similar to the ones that we had on the opposite side. They're just a bit shorter, and at the very top they have ultrasonic sensors. We used ultrasonic for this ones instead of infrared. They're also distance sensors, but we used ultrasonic because they're cheaper, and basically it was enough for the level of precision that we wanted from this. And you'll notice that right behind them they have a little Bluetooth speaker. We wanted them to actually have kind of like self-contained sound, but frankly we ran out of time. It was like, you know what, buy 6 Bluetooth speakers, and we did. And inside of this ones, there's an Electrosmith Daisy, and each one of them is playing just one note. And then as people would bring their hand closer to the pipe, the volume of that note would ramp up. So I would tell people that there was a chord hidden in the installation to see if they could find it. And it was just a matter of everybody standing close to a pipe, and then they could control kind of like loudness relationships. And it was actually an ambichord. I believe it was... I'm not sure if it was a C over a D minor triad, but that might have been it. Something like that. Something fairly... It was pretty. It was pretty. But it was also the same kind of aesthetics that the cart had, so everything together kind of was providing melody and harmony, and then variations in harmony depending on how people were engaging with it, but they were all playing just one note. And in fact, for the development of this one, do you remember Alex?
Yeah.
Alex
Wu.
Alex Wu. Alex Wu. Yeah, I think Kue is his name.
Yeah, that's his like Chinese Mandarin name.
Exactly, but Alex Wu. Alex Wu played a part in this. I was a bit swamped with the development of the Max patch, and I was like, hey, you've worked with Daisy before, write a program that does this and allows me to change notes with the encoder, and that's what Alex developed. And so Alex also has his little grain of salt here.
Yeah. Shout out to Alex.
Yeah, shout out to Alex.
Well, David, this does bring us to the end of the interview. Really appreciate your perspective. Thanks for your time. Where can people find you on the internet?
I mean, if someone wants to find me on the internet, I'm assuming my website is the best place to look at my work, sound-architect.com. Otherwise, Instagram is a good place to see some of my work and potentially, and to connect rather. LinkedIn, Instagram, I tend to not connect too much with people whom I don't know. But if they write, hey, I saw the thing with Amog, then maybe. But anyway, those and in my website there's handles for all my socials, so you can use any of that. But thank you for having me. Thank you for this. This was just as fun as I remembered it. Last time though we didn't have the video component, so I appreciate the technological developments you've brought to your interviewing process.
Yeah, right.
But it's good to see you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks. Cool. This one, an hour and 15. Bye bye.